I'm interested in new paradigms in economics, because I think if ever a field of study needed a new paradigm, it is economics. So the title of this talk is Economics as Relationships. Now, I don't mean mathematical relationships, I mean human relationships. Conventional economics has focused almost entirely on the production and distribution of material goods and services, and ignored, you could even say corroded, the area of human relationships. But if we actually just stop a moment and think, and let's put aside for a moment the effects of advertising, what do you actually really value more? Material goods and things, or your relationships with your fellow human beings? We haven't got time for a show of hands. I'll assume it's the latter and move on. That sounds the right thing to do. And if we think about what is society, is it actually just a collection of independent, separate individuals? Or is it actually a network of relationships? And if we actually think about what the fabric is upon which our society is woven, is it not this network of relationships? And shouldn't our economics reflect this? Now, let's look at relationships. I think we need to look at two types. The obvious one is relationships between individuals, but we also need to consider the relationship between the individual and society as a whole. So I'd like to talk about and get you to focus on relationships. And what sort of relationships would you hope to find in a healthy economy? Things like honesty, surely, trust, loyalty, sense of service, satisfaction. On the other hand, we have to admit this is not always what we find. We may find the exact opposite: dishonesty, mistrust, exploitation, servitude, and dissatisfaction. And which of those do you prefer? I'm going to summarize those on the left and say these are the relationships we would expect in the situation where justice prevails, whereas conversely, those on the other side are what we'd expect if injustice prevails. And I'm going to say that in the new paradigm, the chief function of the economist is to discern those conditions under which justice prevails and promote those and prevent the conditions which promotes injustice. Let's take some examples. Maybe the obvious place to start is the concept of money, which traditionally, although it's just a means of exchange, we often think of as a thing, and possibly a thing to acquire and accumulate. In fact, for some people, the purpose of life is to accumulate money. And probably not stopping to think very much where this money is coming from. We have this phrase, making money. Often when you look at it, it's actually more accurately described as taking money, because it's generally the process of transferring money from those who probably most deserve it and moving it towards those who most want to acquire it. So we would say that when injustice prevails, it's possible to acquire claims to goods and services far in excess of what has been contributed and thus deprive others of their due. So what was it to think of money as a relationship? As a relationship between the individual and society. Supposing I've got £1,000 in my bank account, if only. What does that mean? Essentially, it's a token that represents previously I have provided the economy, the society, with a certain amount of goods and services, and this is a token of what I have provided, and therefore what I am due to take out in return. It's a sort of sense of the position of balance. The relationship. So here, money is a token representing what we have contributed to the economy and so what we are able to take out in return. And where this is played out, where most economic relationships are played out, is in the market. And essentially this is a very potent and powerful place because it enables this exchange to take place. It enables us to contribute and therefore to exchange what we have produced for what we want and need. But we have to admit it doesn't always work out like that, and it is possible within the market system for certain elements to acquire powers and privileges, which means that these exchanges are not even, and there's a possibility of exploitation and the exchange taking place to the advantage of one of the parties. And that's the conditions when injustice prevails. One party dominates and is able to exploit the other for their own benefit. Contrast that with a situation where justice prevails, and the key here it's an exchange between free and equal parties, and both are better off after the exchange. When the market works well, it can work for the benefit of everyone. Let's take a particular example, an obvious one, which affects almost all of us, but particularly potent for young people, and that's the housing market. And let's look at it as a relationship between the provider and the acceptor, the landlord and the tenant, and ask which of those conditions prevail. Is this an exchange between equals, or does one party have the upper hand? And let's ask, well, why does the landlord have the upper hand? Is it just a condition of supply and demand? Well, there is something actually special about the housing market, peculiar, and the key to understanding the housing market is not about houses. It's about where they are, because the fact is you can't have a house unless you have somewhere to put it. So the housing market is really about land and location. And the thing about location is it's in fixed supply. You can't make more of it. So what you have is a situation where a location is paramount. Each location is effectively unique, so it's effectively a monopoly situation. And the effect of that is the landlord really can charge whatever he can get away with, and the tenant, on the other hand, really has to pay as much as he can afford, and it's probably slightly more than that. Well, what's behind this? Let's go down another level and consider housing not as a thing in itself, but as a relationship, particularly the land, the location, as a relationship between that individual site and the rest of society as a whole. And ask, well, where does the value of a particular location come from? Is it intrinsic in the site, or is it actually to do with the relationship between that particular location and the rest of society? And if you think about it, no location has an intrinsic value. It's all about its relationship with the rest of society. The location is actually totally dependent on its value by the rest of society, primarily to provide the legal function, the property rights, and so on. But particularly, the entire value of that location comes from the society around it. So let's have a look at this relationship between particularly the owner of land and the rest of society. And at the moment, it's looking pretty one-sided. And I think really the key question to ask, economics as relationships, is what's the other side of the bargain? What is the owner of land giving back in return? Now, I haven't got time to expand on this, but I think once we start looking at this in terms of relationships, can really open up this whole issue, particularly of the housing market, which is so important for young people, and actually find a way of making this into a more even and equitable arrangement. Finally, I'd just like to look at the issue of a job. Again, easy to think of it as a thing, a possession. And to look at the employee. In the conventional paradigm, labour is actually regarded as a thing, a commodity, something to be bought in, something for which there's a market, supply and demand, and you keep the supply up by having unemployment. And the effect of that is that generally wages go as low as they can be pressed. It becomes a cost of production to be kept to a minimum so that somebody else can get the benefit. In the new paradigm, we would see a job employment as a relationship, a mutually enhancing relationship between the employer and the employee, an opportunity for each to make a contribution and in return receive their just and fair portion of the wealth produced. Okay, so there's a brief introduction into economics as relationships, a view that puts human relations above material goods, and I think provides an opportunity for hope. It also provides a method of introducing the all-important concept of justice into economics and providing the opportunity of a vision for freedom and prosperity for everyone and not just a privileged few. Thank you very much.